welcome. Happy Tuesday. We got a good crew ready to join Rob and I today. Rob, how's your day going?
Fantastic, Dave. Ready for some customer success.
So there we go. Well, you got to be a happy guy with you're Boston, right?
Yeah.
That's right,
Well, not a Boston fan. I'm a New York sports fan, sadly. I
man.
grew up in the I grew up in the New York area. I'm a Jets fan, diehard. I'm a Mets fan, not a Mets fan, a Yankees fan.
Uh,
I'm a reluctant Mets fan, so I'm not one of those Yankee fans that doesn't like Mets fans.
uh,
Um, Knicks fan, you know, it's
uh,
I got it's terrible.
Hopefully, don't tell too many people that Boston, New York thing is fairly.
Well,
Um,
you guys in Utah blessed us with Zach Wilson, so thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. Coming closer. I'll thank COVID. That was a great COVID year for my New York Islanders. Well,
Yeah, absolutely.
for my
It's deceived all of us.
That's right. That's right. Well, I know we've got quite a few that are already joining. I'm sure there'll be more that will be hopping on. Thank you, everyone, for taking some time out today to join Rob with Success Scaled and me. The webinar is brought to you by Guide CX, the number one client onboarding solution. Very connected, very closely connected, I should say, with the customer success world. And we appreciate Rob spending a couple of minutes with everybody. So, Rob, feel free to introduce yourself and Success Scaled. And we got a really exciting topic today.
Yeah, I am very excited for this topic. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart, although candidly, I never wished it were because I tried my best throughout my career to avoid it. So, the topic today is fundamentals of customer expansion. So, expansion of revenue streams from your customers. So, some quick background on me. I hope you guys didn't see my screen, right?
Yep,
Look
we're
good?
good.
Cool. So some quick background on me. As Dave mentioned, I'm a customer success consultant by trade. I've built and scaled three customer success teams in my career. I'm fortunate to say there have been some wins along the way, along some losses, but some wins where expansion was core to our customer success function. Where, in the best example of this, our customer success team at one of the companies that I was at, we built an engine that generated 2/3 of net new revenue. And I
Wow.
haven't seen a lot of customer success teams. And by the way, we did it through a really streamlined onboarding process. Um, haven't seen a lot of customer success teams that have been able to do that. So I have a lot of folks to thank for being with me on that journey. But yeah, as I said, that's not something I ever expected to say in my past because I think I'm case in point example of what I'd consider to be a reluctant salesperson. I actually thought of calling this presentation Confessions of a Reluctant Salesperson. Um, and that is why I gave this presentation a deliberately cheesy title. Um, it's very interesting because people look at this title, Coffee is for Closers, and some people know it off the bat. And they're like, oh, why is this guy giving us this stereotypical sales 101 type training?
Mhm.
And then other people look at that and they actually don't know the reference. And interestingly, that division is usually really apparent between sales people, where like every salesperson, they start a new job, they watch this clip from Glengarry Glen Ross, which is where this is from, or from Boiler Room or whatever, probably rolling their eyes. And then there's customer success people who oftentimes don't even know this reference because been built, they haven't built their careers in a very sales focused environment.
Mhm.
So normally, I'm going to skip it this time. Normally, what I do, I usually show a clip from the movie, but I'm going to skip over that to spare you guys the details. Um, I do want you guys all to chime in on the chat or feel free to virtually raise your hands if anything here relates to you.
Yep.
Um, so I want you to think critically about some questions like whether you in the audience identify as a salesperson.
And
I look, go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to say, I know we got a couple of people. Rob mentioned chat. use the Q&A. Feel free to make comments in there. We're keeping an eye on that. So that's the easiest way to engage on the chat or on the conversation today. We'll get to as many of those questions as we can, and as anybody that's joined us before, that's a great part of these webinars is some awesome follow-up conversations that we're excited to join. So I will say, just from a background of spending a decade in CS and now as a salesperson, Rob's spot on. The world of sell or be sold. CSMs are selling, they just don't realize it. So this is going to be something I hope everybody's excited about. Rob's an expert, so this is going to be good.
Yeah, apologies for saying chat. I love one of the answers we already got. Someone says nope to this question. It says, I do not identify as a salesperson. I'm too much of a sensitive Pisces. So I love that, which is how I felt early in my career, although Capricorn. But um, so think about these questions and do feel free to chime in. Do you identify as a salesperson? A lot of people in customer success say no. And when we think of sales folks, we think of memes like this or something like this. I'm something of a whatever you just said myself. Um, and I want you to think about this question too of, have you heard this debate? And I know if you're in customer success, which most people in this audience are, or anything post-sale, you've probably heard this debate about who should own expansion, sales or CS. So it's like the age-old debate, right? Or if you think about this question, whether you want and need to refine your sales skills. I think this is really interesting because most of us have seen our industry shift where sales skills were a nice to have. Probably in like 2020, 2021, that era of the venture capital world where there was money flying around like Halloween candy. Um, but now a lot of us are kind of pressed up against this pressure where it's no longer an option. That's why I usually also recommend people think about this. How often do they see this hashtag open to work? I know when I open up LinkedIn, this is something that comes up all the time. And I'm fortunate in my job as a consultant, by the way, to be in a position where I can connect people in the world, people looking for jobs with clients of mine. So I think I've had around, I don't know, 10 or so successful placements in the last year. So I'm not a recruiter, but just do it because I like being a good community person. Um, but this underscores the severity of this topic, where it's not really an option anymore for us to be debating about whether or not we're sellers. And I came to realize that um, all I ever did, despite avoiding sales, all I ever did in my career was sales. Going back to when I was a waiter at a diner when I was 18 years old, working the overnight shift, to then I was in the food industry, started a food business. And even though I wasn't calling myself a salesperson, I was selling all the time and then moving into SaaS. And so the last thing is to ask yourself sort of, why do I feel uncomfortable selling? And that's a good question, right? It's always important just to go a layer deeper. And again, feel free to chime in with the Q&A if you have an immediate answer to this. But usually when I ask this, people pause and they sort of stop and reflect. And they're like, actually, I don't know. Why do I feel weird selling? So quick bit about me. Like I mentioned, I've worked at, I don't know how many different companies this is, like 18 or something like 16, something like that. And then I recently started this consulting practice to help with two main focuses. One is building and scaling customer success teams from scratch at early stage programs. Or two is helping drive high net revenue retention by building out really efficient expansion motions for CS teams. But I don't want to talk about myself. I want to talk about you. And if I ask myself this, what brought people here today? Well, it's probably because you want to leave this session with a practical, actionable playbook that you can bring to your day to day so that you can start expanding your customers more effectively. And we'll talk about why that's important and unpack that a bit. But I do think that this diagram on the right is something important to briefly take a look at, which if you stop and ask yourself, what is the core charter of our customer success team or our post-sale function or whatever you want to call it, whether it's account management or post-sales, customer success, the label doesn't matter. No matter what you call it, typically there's three main legs of the stool that you want to focus on if your goal is creating a proactive revenue generating function. And that's retention in the top left. Upsell, cross sell is in the top right. Customer advocacy is here in the bottom. And that matters most by way of referrals. But the thing is, we in the post sales world, we often get so caught up in this world of thinking about things like NPS and usage metrics and activation that we often lose sight of the big picture that we can be actually driving net new revenue from every one of these processes. By the end, we're going to get into how you could even incorporate expansion into your onboarding process, your support processes, and that kind of thing. So I want you guys to leave with an actionable playbook, and you'll see how we'll model this out. I actually model this as a multi-stage plan, like a hypothetical 30, 60, 90 plan that you can take to your management that goes through how you own the case to, well, how do you earn the seat at the table to own expansion to begin with, especially relevant for those of you that are debating with your sales teams about who should own it. Then how do you actually train your team to pitch effectively, which not all of us have done. How do you then start scaling it into different parts of the operation? And then how do you iterate at scale and master the customer journey once again? So I did want to ask a question to the group around what is expansion, but I first want to just take a moment to take a look at the Q&A here.
Yeah, I thought it
can't
was
speak and read at the same time, so go ahead, Dave.
Rob, I thought it was funny. I mean, clearly, this is a group that has. I'll use the analogy. There's been a lot of people that have gone and bought cars and not had a great experience. You've got Ted that says, "Hey, what's the difference between a salesperson and a con man?" And in the reality, in my opinion, of what I see, it's the outcome that we're looking for. It's the intention of improving that relationship with the customer. And that, to Rob's great point, it's not just about retention. The happiest customers are those ones that are continuing to join with us and expand with what they're doing, right, Rob?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple great call outs here. Someone says they're a recovering salesperson. Someone says, I've been told I'm a salesperson, but I won't admit it, which is very interesting. And I think it's because some of us think like my buddy who I work with here, I worked with him at two jobs. I'm visiting with a client right now and just was able to hire this VP of sales. They think of this example where one time, like, I don't recommend doing this, but he pulled it off as a joke. Someone said, it kind of feels like you're like a used car salesman. And he's like, well, what's wrong with a used car salesman? My father was a used car salesman, sold used cars for years and fed a family of four. And we got off the call and I was like, your dad was a used car salesman? He's like, no, I just said that. And I was like, okay, I'm calling this customer back up just to let them know that was not, that was just a joke. But that's not typical. That was just a customer that we had a good rapport with and we're just messing around with.
Yep.
But yeah, so if we stop and we think like, what even is expansion, right? What is customer expansion, right? And I would best define it as the increase in revenue attributable to existing customers, right? And modeled out differently, some people even include customer advocacy motions as part of expansion. I'm going to leave that off the table for now, but if you do want to talk about things like referral programs, I'd be happy to talk through that separately. But we'll just focus on things like upsell, cross-sell, upgrades, additional seats, higher tiers and usage. Now, it is fundamentally different when you're just trying to sell higher tiers, more data, more seats, versus like cross-selling net new products. There is nuance and difference there. But think about your use case here and what you're selling and know that certain advice will only be relevant to some of those buckets. And if we think about why it's important now, I think the evidence is that, first of all, we're seeing that the data shows that customers who buy more stick around longer. I love this second one, which is that if you expand your customers, it allows you to churn your non-ICP customers, your squeaky wheels that were never a good fit to begin with, and you can get away with it because you're expanding your good fit customers. Obviously, number three, nobody's complaining about having more money in their pocket. And if you're working on any comp planning, let me know because that's a topic that I've been working on a lot lately with different CS teams. And then the last part is that expansion is what helps you build and scale a large team. So, like when I was at Qualia, where customer success made up two-thirds of net new revenue, customer success was 82 people by the time I left, which started with one, right? 82 people out of 250 person organization was pretty cool. And I think we ask ourselves, right, why is expansion hard? So let's come back to this question. It's not always as simple as this meme on the left, which is almost an exact depiction of my first upsell in SaaS, where the CEO came up to me, he high-fived me at lunch, and I was like, why am I getting a high five? Are you going to hit me? He was like, heard you're slinging some product. And I was like, am I? Oh, of course I am. Yeah, of course, yeah. The upgrade. Meanwhile, all that I ever did was just customer called and said, hey, can we switch to your enterprise plan? And I was like, yeah, of course. And I just changed the toggle. Then a gong went off, didn't know why. Uh, Here I am taking credit for it without even realizing it,
Go. But excited.
but excited. But seriously, so if you think about why is this hard, right? Why is it hard? Well, for a variety of reasons. You're selling to a limited TAM, you have total addressable market, you have a very small, narrow window of customers that's usually orders of magnitude smaller than that your sales team is selling to for early stage companies. You might like this client that I'm with right now, they have tens of like over 10,000 possible companies that they could be selling to in the market, but a very narrow window of customers that are already, well, a narrow window of those that are actual customers. I think number two is interesting too, right? You're running the risk of burning customer relationships. And this is what I hear most commonly, which is why we hesitate to sell to our customers. Ironically, I've seen the opposite. I've seen that customers trust us more when we sell to them and we do it in an obvious manner. Number three is interesting. A lot of teams that are putting a lot of pressure on expansion, they're starting to burn out their teams. I'm seeing this commonly where the CS team is like presented with this quote unquote opportunity to sell. And they're like, haha, I have so much on my plate. This is really cute. I love that you want me to expand these customers, but I'm working on low NPS scores and I'm working on this churning customer. And I've got this other customer stuck in onboarding. And I've got this other customer who's blowing up my email inbox or whatever. So that's something to consider, right? Is your team already maxed out? And then the last thing, a lot of teams and companies have not invested in any sales training for their customer success or post-sale function, which is kind of interesting. And I think the world has come around to see the error in that. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be having this webinar right now. But I did want to pause there. I don't know if there's been anything coming up in the chat that or the Q&A that we could call out.
Sure. So there's a great question here, Rob, about where does reducing initial discounts from the initial sale, longer term contracts fall in expansion. So how does that plan we can come to? I think what's also interesting, just a quick footnote before you answer that, you talked about selling skills and practicing. How many of you started by saying you're a recovering salesperson? You actually have some of those skills and that knowledge, but we're back to Rob's point. We're focused so much on the post sale that we forget that those selling skills are just as important with selling the idea of utilizing your product, excuse me, your product and things like that even more. But Rob, do you want to talk about the expansion and initial longer term contract discussion?
Yeah, let's hear the question one more time. I was looking for it in the chat, but I
Sure.
was having a hard time reading.
Where does reducing initial discounts from the initial sale and longer contract terms fall in expansion, i.e., selling a 3-year deal versus a 1-year deal.
That's interesting. So we're talking about for the initial sale, like does it make sense to sell a longer term in most cases, and I hope I'm understanding this question correctly. In most cases, I generally optimize for 1 year on that first contract, not a multi-year deal, because it gives you the opportunity to expand the customer later on. Even just something as simple as a price increase. A lot of times we in customer success, like or post sales or renewals or whatever, we're kind of kicked with this responsibility to, oh, just like get a 5% price increase across the line. And I'm like, just or 10% even. So help me understand if I'm answering the question. I want to make sure that I actually hit the nail on the head.
And we can definitely come back to that as well as it's a little bit of a an initial sell versus that expansion post sell.
Yeah.
But we can come back to that. And I also think this is one of the most common question that comes up in most of the webinars that we've done and these conversations is who actually owns expansion? Should it be two separate teams? Should the CSM own that? Should there be an expansion team? And Rob, maybe we can touch on that one, but it is a really big, it depends, right?
And that's exactly where I'm going to go next. So let's get into this playbook that I was saying. So starts with making the case of who should own expansion, right? Because you have to earn the seat at the table with the executive team. You have to earn the right to own expansion. You can't just say, I want it and leave it at that. And that's how I did it at first. That's how I screwed up. I started and I was like, I really deserve this. I want this for my career. And I was like, how many times did I say I and my and me and all of this? And I didn't prove it with my track record, right? So I learned to ask myself these questions. Can I speak fluently about terms like sales efficiency and burn ratios and my conversion rates and my win rates and my LTV to CAC ratios? Can I speak fluently about these terms? And do I actually know these workflows around tracking dials and cadences? Have I led by example? That was another question that I had to ask myself. And what I had to do actually was kind of interesting. I had to just ask forgiveness and not permission and just start selling to my customer base so that I could show I have a proven track record of selling effectively to our customer base. I don't necessarily recommend that to you guys, but you can get away with it. And I had to figure out the last question too of like, do I have internal blockers? Do I have expectations that were set differently with other members of the team? And do I have to navigate those politically? Um, and then I had to get into how do I forecast effectively? The word forecast was, I noticed, my magic wand to get my C-level leaders' attention. Because if I said I had a forecast, they were always curious to see what was inside, right? So I won't go into the details about how to do all of that just now. Can get a bit technical. But when we're thinking about like from a high level, take an honest look, what is the right ownership model? There are pros and cons of sales owning expansion. There are plenty of good, really successful companies where sales owns expansion. And there are companies where it's not very effective, right? So feel free to throw in the Q&A any pros and cons that come to mind. I'll give this just a second and then I'll share what I consider to be my answer key.
And while those are coming in, I can tell you that here at Guide CX, we've got a little bit of a hybrid model, and the CSMs and the AEs work very closely together. For us, we found that's worked really well in managing and maintaining those relationships together and not becoming polarizing. But again, there's a lot of variables that go into that. But let's see what we've got. Customers should trust the guidance of the CSM account manager. Absolutely, Sam. That's part of that relationship, that long-term relationship where I'm sure most of you in customer success really, really love and value that long-term versus the short, blast of the sale. Let's see, Rob, other comments.
There's a lot of good ones in here. Like pros, learning the voice of the customer, con, getting buy-in from the company on product changes. after hearing the voice of the customer. It's bad comp structures. I see that. Comp is definitely influential.
Okay.
Let me go ahead. I'll share what I have listed here, if that's okay. And I love that these answers are still coming in. We're going to have more of an answer, more time to unpack this just momentarily. So what I have, this is my answer. There are tons of pros with sales owning expansion, right? There's reasons to find that prospect very alluring. Sales knows how to carry a quota. Sales knows how to manage a pipeline. By the way, sales probably is the one that got all the training for this stuff. Sales knows how to use different automation tools. Sales knows how to pitch effectively. And they can also sell uninterrupted, as opposed to us. So, like, we get a negative NPS score and we have to stop what we're doing and maybe go handle it. Hopefully not, but in some organizations. But there's tons of cons, right? The canonical examples are that sales has bad timing and they lack context and they burn bridges. They oversell customers, right? But I think the biggest one to think about is, does expansion selling for your sales team trade off with net new deal flow? Because that, for most of us, is precious. And that, to me, I found was my ticket to get my CEO's ear to say, yeah, we could have the sales team sell to our existing customers, but do we really want to trade off with net new deal flow? And the answer to that was no. And we could like flip that on its head, right? You can say like CS, the pros of CS owning expansion is that we have perfect timing, we have ample context, we win customer trust. It's a cleaner experience for the customer. That's what I saw several people call out in the Q&A. It also may reduce operating costs, which is really valuable. But I will say, in my experience, finding CS folks or post-sale folks who can sell really effectively has sometimes felt like finding a unicorn. It's not a bad thing, but but the truth of the matter is we often lack there are many of us in this field that lack the interest or the skill or the time. So you might not want to ask yourself, well, which of these is my blocker, right? Um, People say that it risks burning the trusted advisor relationship with the customer. Like I said, I think that's I think that's not true in my experience. I've only increased my legitimacy to the customer by selling to them. They know what they're in this for, what we're in this for, right? They know that we're a business. Um, but I want to show some hybrid models too, really quickly, just flash over them. I wanted to quickly see if there was anything interesting in the Q&A that came up. Anything you wanted to call out, Dave?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting things. One is, hey, we grow through expansion, through referrals. Um, so how does that factor into who owns what?
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, co-selling. I mean, that's one thing that when it comes to this slide of cons for CS, there is an ugly word that a lot of people in customer success, and again, I feel it. There's this word called quota, and it's got some negative connotations. And I think that when utilizing the right structure and utilizing the right terminology, what's in a name, that can help overcome some of those barriers as well for, hey, I don't like that stress of holding that number over my head and those kind of things. In working, hey, give the quota to the sales rep, but there's a different expectation for the CSMs and things like that. Um,
Yeah, I have conflicting feelings about co-selling. I'm
let's say
usually
that's great.
I'm usually like, please back off. Like, um, like to me, sometimes co-selling feels like someone like I have to sort of rely on somebody, and I'm sort of a fan of the phrase like I don't want to put the key to my happiness in someone else's pocket. Like I can run this independently, I can do this, and I usually tell my executive team like, do you want to double our CAC, our customer acquisition cost? Because sure, then yeah, lend me some help, but like I don't know if I really feel like I need it. And I'm not saying I'm like cocky or anything like that. Certainly not. I've made a lot of mistakes along the way, but I just tended to find that it didn't make sense for the business or the customer. There are some hybrid models that I'll just flash over really quick. In some cases, the CS team owns low revenue expansion, sales owns high revenue. CS owns low complexity deals, sales owns high complexity deals, or CS owns demo setting, sales owns closing. I don't like any of these personally. I could elaborate on why another time. The one that I actually do like most for when it's affordable is this commercial CSM role. which is my version of a rebrand on the traditional account management role, where you have someone who reports into customer success, but their sole focus is expansion selling. Now, making the case for this type of role is sometimes difficult and not always affordable, but if you're working on making that case, let me know. I'm happy to share some examples that I've done in the past. Um, some interesting, good stuff coming up in the Q&A. I want to try to fly through the rest so that we can get back to it. Unless, Dave, if you want to chime in now, we could get to a couple of these before I get into phase two here, or we could just leave it to the end.
Yeah. Let's we've got there's some really good stuff coming. I've seen the preview, so I think everybody's going to want to see the chapter two here.
So chapter two, and I'll try to keep this to about 5 minutes, is how do you actually prepare your team to sell? So congratulations, you made the case, you're winning expansion. Okay, well, now what do you do? So how do you mentally prepare CS sellers? Well, I think there's a lot of validity in this last bullet of reminding CSMs that imposter syndrome is super normal. I think it's good to be transparent about that, and that we're not building this Glengarry Glen Ross type culture. That the customer often wants to be sold to, that nothing bad is going to happen, and that they can refine their skills by practicing on every willing ear. I mean, I would practice my upselling on my house plant if I had to. And there are other strategies that I've found, like you can sell to low risk deals to start, right? Maybe sell to your customer advisory board customers. You have those. Sell to your low ARR customers. That's low risk. Or your gatekeepers, or your disqualified deals. You know, you're not wasting your time if you're actually doing it for a defined period just to refine your skills. And it helps you develop qualification criteria along the way. Um, I've learned that once you're in, basically, to get in the door, there's a lot you have to do that we are already accustomed to in customer success, like champion development. Um, and those of us that own renewals probably know this question well, or if you don't, you should, which is to ask the customer, what is your internal approval process for making this decision? And I don't know why, but I often find that we just like forget some of these fundamentals post sale that are inherent pre sale. Um, and often we forget to be targeting veto. I don't know how many people know this term, veto. Veto is not my uncle in Staten Island who taught me how to throw a liver punch. Well, might be, but but veto is very important top officer, and I think it's a real skill that I've had to learn to be able to have a conversation where I've earned my seat at the table with that important top officer. And I've learned to use talk tracks, right? Like to be transparent with a customer. And I think some of you guys could use this today to say, look, I'm not on the sales team. I'm on the customer success team. My job here is to make sure that you've adopted all lines of our product across all lines of your business. Do you mind if I show you this new tool? There's a lot of nuance that you may not even notice that I did there, even down to the fact that I say, do you mind? Right? Because I notice that when I'm talking to naysayers, what do they want to say? They want to say no, right? So it's like if you say, are you open to seeing this? And they say no, they're like, okay, well, I guess we're not talking now. But if you say, do you mind? And they say no, well, then you've sort of, I'm not recommending you should manipulate your customers, but I do think there's a lot of linguistic truth behind how we sort of phrase questions. And there's a lot of persuasive skills that go into that. I like to tell customers too, like, look, I'm perfectly fine with not proceeding. If all I get is your feedback, that's still a win for me. That's a good way to remind the customer that this is a win-win situation. However, I do think there's ROI here, and I think we should contract on this. So I will be pursuing that as our end goal. Sometimes I've even told customers, the best feedback you can give us is after you've purchased this new product, this cross-sell product or whatever. I've had to learn also not to sell the F words. So what are the F words? F words are features and functionality. So sell value, right? Now, I've learned that when I do a demo, I barely even show the products usually. I'm mostly just talking about the customer's pain points, commiserating with them. And then only then do I talk about the value propositions and then just a quick flash on features and functionality because we've aligned on the existential reasoning for this conversation. I'm going to skip a lot of the pros tips here just for the sake of time. But I do think a lot of CS teams lack objection rebuttal documents, and I would be happy to share examples of where CS teams have really effectively built amazing objection rebuttal documents, even for renewals, right? Like for example, we often use ROI calculators in sales. We don't use them in customer success for some reason. We often use competitive battle cards in sales. We don't use them when our customer is thinking about working with a competitor instead of us, which is kind of crazy. I mean, think about it. Um, and there's other pro tips, but I want to make sure I kept that part to about 5 minutes, and we can get check the audience for any thoughts and questions.
Yep, Rob, you've gotten a great compliment. You are bucketed by Connor as a unicorn. Congratulations. That's high praise.
I
Uh,
appreciate that. I've just screwed up a lot.
so basically the question is, assuming the team, the CS team is not full of unicorns, how do you
Hmm.
minimize the negative impact of selling to existing customers and having customer success own it instead? I'll take a little creative liberty.
So yes, that's a good question, and it sort of presupposes that there is negative impact. And we have to unpack what is that negative impact? What are those negative impacts? Do they manifest in different forms, and why do they exist? So I don't want to answer a question with a question, but the negative impacts could be like if it's something like burning the trusted advisor relationship with a customer, well, that's probably actually because you haven't mastered your talk tracks that we were just going through to position yourself as we always say, like a strategic advisor to the client, and that we're recommending them products based on the evidence that we see on the ground. This is another reason why I love CS owning expansion motions is because we have so much data at our fingertips that sales is not accustomed to pulling when they're going into like customer data, live customer data, when we're going into an expansion conversation.
Yep. Um, Keep in mind too that to that point of having the right conversations, understanding the business model to become a trusted advisor, that organically opens up those conversations versus just trying to pitch products, pitch licenses, like Rob was talking about earlier. That is a great skill that falls within that sales training curriculum mentioned earlier. That it's important to listen for and foster and strike up those conversations that lead to, hey, I can help you solve that problem. Let's talk about how we go about doing that.
Yeah,
Uh,
I love that.
you got
I
another great
Go ahead.
question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rob.
Sure. No. Let's hear it.
So another great question. What's the best advice when you're stuck in tactical resources who are unwilling to introduce you to executives? Use LinkedIn, go to exec direct yourself, even if you're asked and they said no. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So a lot of times, I mean, we can't forget the fact that a lot of times there are people who are paid to be gatekeepers, right? That is their job. It is to filter you from the decision maker. And there's a lot of indirect strategies like I heard something about like a multi-channel approach, like using LinkedIn. That might be a strategy. Personally, I've often found that I have to become the gatekeeper's best friend. So I'm like, hey, so and so, me again. Like, what's going on? And I get to know them. I get to hear their story or whatever. And the thing is, they're often users of whatever product I'm selling anyway, in some capacity. Um, so there's no simple answer to this. It depends in large part on the product and your org structure. But multi-thread as much as possible, right? Maybe there's even somebody in between the gatekeeper and your economic buyer who's an influencer in the decision.
There you go. Great practical question. It's easy to talk through. Hey, this makes sense. This is easy. Why wouldn't everybody do it? How do you get CSM buy-in when they are very opposed to the idea of actually selling?
So again, it's essential to ask why they're opposed. Is it because they lack the skill? Is it because they lack the time? Is it because they don't want to identify as someone who sells things? And the reason it's the same thing as like it's almost like asking like why would a customer churn? Well, or like how do you prevent a customer from churning? Well, you have to kind of unpack the reason why they churn. Are they churning because of budget? Are they churning because of they're going out of business, or they're churning for a competitor, right? So you have to unpack the reason why and then dive into like, is this more an existential coaching question, or is it more of a tactical skills question that they need, or is it something different, right? Like they're just bogged down with other stuff. So speaking of being bogged down by other stuff, I really want to like show you guys this next section real quick, which is around how to scale. And some of these strategies I thought were crazy, but I tried them anyway, and they worked out really well for me. The first one is selling during onboarding. So that example that I gave where customer success made up 2/3 of net new revenue, it was because of a dialed in onboarding process that we were able to do that. So what we did that turned out to be super effective, we created an onboarding process where an inherent part of the onboarding process, and we were transparent with customers from the get-go. An inherent part of the onboarding process was that the customers would be introduced to the other products in our suite. We would tell customers the mark of a successful customer to us, like we've studied successful customers in this space often. One thing we do see is that they're those that are at least aware of all the tools that we have in our offering that could be beneficial. And we often do that with all the right stakeholders on the call. So why don't we just, at the point of kickoff, we'd ask this, like, why don't we just go ahead now and schedule at the end of our onboarding process, we'll introduce you to our other products. And guess what? If you finish our onboarding process, you get a rebate on your onboarding fee. That customers always perked up at that idea. So they were like, so you're telling me that all I have to do is finish onboarding and check out your other stuff, which I want to do anyway, frankly, and I get paid to do that with a rebate? Like, sign me up all day, right? So, and we also incentivize our onboarders, by the way. We spiff them like crazy uh, to to make sure they set these demos. And it was just this beautiful incentive alignment between customers and CSMs and my C level.
Uh, uh,
But do ask yourself, do I have an incentive for my customers to expand? A lot of times the answer is no. Are you going to say, Dave?
well, you brought up a hot topic, which we'll probably just have to begin the initial unpacking. But the age-old question is, do we charge for onboarding? And if we
Yeah,
don't charge for onboarding, what precedent does that set moving forward into expansion selling? How much you charge, all that good stuff. So I don't know if you've got anything you wanted to share.
I strongly recommend charging for onboarding. I didn't used to do it, and I get no showed all the time. And I also like my sales team couldn't sell very effectively because they didn't have any like sort of lever to pull to move the deal through the pipeline more quickly. And I didn't have any levers to pull to incentivize the customer to take this onboarding seriously. And then also, like I said, get a rebate at the end of onboarding.
Beautiful.
I even ended up incorporating, and I love this strategy, as long as it's done well, incorporating selling into my support strategy. So I had my support folks sales trained, and also like, I gave them collateral, like here's some objection rebuttal documentation in case you need it. But basically the main thing I gave them was like, here's how you identify a customer that is prime for expansion, because you're pulling up their account page every time you handle one of their phone calls or their tickets. And I recently had this done to me by LegalZoom support. I called LegalZoom as a customer. I was having this technical issue, and the rep said to me, I noticed that you haven't done this filing. And I was like, oh, interesting. Tell me more. He walked me through a risk that was posed to my business, what I could do about it, how LegalZoom could help. And I was just like, take my money. Like, I love what you just did here, because you educated me on something that I didn't even know was a risk to my business. So there are really elegant ways to do this. Obviously, you got to be really careful, because this is where I think you can burn customer trust most. But there are positive ways to do it.
Sure. Um, so we're right up at time, and here's the great thing. Rob, I don't know if you've got your contact information. Again, Rob is an incredible mind, as I'm sure all of you have noticed. Please do not hesitate to reach out to Rob, if as conversations are important to have. Rob, do you have that to share with everybody?
Yeah. What I was just going to close out on is, oh, let me reshare. Sorry. What I was just going to close out on is there's a lot to be done once you actually get this motion going to iterate on it. So that's everything from building out RevOps to mastering your data, obsessing over the customer journey and redoing customer journey mapping every year if you have to, managing pipeline, and hopefully you have that playbook in place in the near future. I've got some resources too I can recommend. But if you want to reach me, hopefully I'm your best resource to answer any questions. Hello@robzambito.com. That's my email. Find me on LinkedIn though. I am happy to answer any questions. Um, and yeah, I enjoy these conversations probably more than I should. So happy to chat through any follow-ups.
Absolutely. We appreciate everybody. And if anyone also is related to that onboarding process, Rob's also an expert in consulting there. We really appreciate everybody. We will be sending, I know there was a lot of questions about that. We'll be sending the recording out. It'll be posted and hosted on the Guide CX website under our events page. Thanks everybody for joining, and look forward to some upcoming topics that we've just barely scratched the surface. One of the most important that's upcoming is, do we charge? How much do we charge? And how do we track that? So appreciate your time, Rob. Thanks everybody for taking some time out of your day.